Okay, let's unpack this. Picture Japan, a place many people see as, incredibly homogenous.
Right.
But dig a little deeper, and you find this persistent, really deeply ingrained form of social stratification. We're talking about the Burakumin.
The term Burakumin. It literally translates to something like hamlet or village people.
Yeah.
But historically, it points to this group defined by exclusion.
Yeah.
Descended from feudal outcast classes.
People marginalized for centuries in Japan.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've dived into, a stack of sources for this. Articles, research papers, our own notes, really trying to get our heads around their story.
Yeah.
Our mission today, I guess, is to trace that history, uncover why this group was ostracized, explore the impact of legal emancipation.
Which wasn't straightforward.
No, definitely not. And look at how discrimination has stubbornly persisted, and follow the long, kind of complex fight for their rights and recognition.
And here's the core insight from our sources, I think. The point that makes this story so powerful. Legal equality.
Yeah.
It isn't the same as social acceptance. Not even close sometimes.
Right. The Burakumin gained equal status legally, over 150 years ago?
Yeah, 1871. But the fight against this deep-seated social stigma, it continues even today for many. That gap between the law and, lived experience, that's what we're really diving into.
So where does this begin? What were the actual roots of this marginalization back in feudal Japan?
Well, a big part of it ties back to traditional Japanese beliefs about purity and impurity, the concept of kigar.
Kigar. Okay, what did that mean exactly? And how did it get sort of attached to people?
So in both Shinto and Buddhist traditions, certain things were seen as ritually polluting, especially anything related to death, blood, decay, that kind of thing.
Right.
And the people whose jobs involved these things, they were seen as handling that impurity. And because of that, they became impure themselves in the eyes of society.
And these weren't minor jobs, were they? The sources list some pretty fundamental occupations.
Absolutely. We're talking about executioners, grave diggers, people working with dead animals in slaughterhouses, butchers, and particularly tanners. Working with animal hides was a major one, strongly associated with impurity.
Wow. So handling death or animal products basically made you an outcast, and that led to formal social divisions.
Yes, it did. It led to the creation of these formal outcast classes. Sources often group them under the term senmin, which means base people.
Base people?
Yeah, and within that group were the hinin, meaning non-persons, literally.
Non-persons.
And the eta, which is a term that, it translates to great filth.
Great filth. Ugh. It's just hard to imagine being labeled that way simply because of your job. And these groups were physically separated too.
Precisely. From the Heian period onwards, these groups were, pushed into living in separate villages or distinct neighborhoods. These were sometimes called etamira or just buraku.
And the restrictions went beyond just where they lived, right?
Oh, very much so. By the Edo period, the sources describe really extensive rules. They had specific dress codes, mandatory hairstyles.
Hairstyle rules?
Yeah. And they were prohibited from entering temples or the homes of common citizens or even schools without getting explicit permission first.
That sounds incredibly restrictive, yet these jobs, even though they were considered impure, they were often essential for society, weren't they?
Exactly. That's a key paradox within the whole system.
Yeah.
Groups like the Kawada, who were associated with tanning, sometimes held monopolies on these necessary trades. They were needed.
Right.
And later, the Tokugawa Shogunate actually relied on the Burakumin for roles like executioners, jailers, torturers, basically, jobs nobody else wanted to do.
So the government itself used them for crucial functions while at the same time reinforcing their outcast status. How did they fit into the overall class structure of the Edo period, that four-tier system?
Right, the Shinyakushu samurai, peasants, craftsmen, merchants. Well, the outcasts weren't even in that system. Modern scholarship clarifies that peasants, craftsmen, and merchants were seen as, roughly equal classifications below the samurai.
Okay.
The Eta and Hinin were positioned firmly below all of them. And we also learned that the shogunate would sometimes use them as scapegoats when things went wrong socially.
It paints a picture of this deeply entrenched system, doesn't it? Where your birth dictated everything, your place, your job, even how you could look or where you could go. But this feudal system, it wasn't permanent.
No, it wasn't. The Meiji Restoration in 1869 marked the formal end of the old feudal caste system. And then in 1871, the new government issued the Senmin Haishire. It's often called the Emancipation Edict, or Kaishire.
Right.
And this decree granted equal legal status to the former outcasts.
Which sounds like, a moment of triumph, right? A huge step towards equality. But the research points to some really difficult unintended consequences, doesn't it?
It really does. And this reveals a crucial, maybe even counterintuitive insight from the sources. For the Burakumin, gaining legal freedom in 1871 actually led, in the short term, to economic hardship and violent backlash.
Wait, how did legal freedom cause hardship? That seems backwards.
Well, the Emancipation Edict stripped them of the exclusive rights they held for certain occupations, like collecting and disposing of dead animals.
Ah, okay.
While these jobs were definitely stigmatized, they provided a livelihood, sometimes even a kind of monopolized income. Losing those rights meant losing their economic base, often leading to a decrease in their living standards, at least initially.
And the reaction from the rest of society wasn't exactly welcoming.
Far from it. There were widespread anti-Kaihura riots. Commoners, maybe fearing a loss of the social hierarchy or, economic competition, attacked former Edo communities.
Seriously, riots against emancipation.
Yeah. Sources describe horrific violence. In one village in Okayama, 4 people were killed, others injured, homes destroyed, just because former Edo tried to buy alcohol like anyone else. Another village saw even more deaths and destruction. It was brutal.
So the legal change didn't just erase the social prejudice. It seems like in some ways it almost inflamed it.
It absolutely highlighted how deeply ingrained the prejudice was, existing independently of the legal structure. And another thing happened when the official ban on eating meat ended in 1871.
Oh, right. Meat consumption became okay.
Yeah. So many former Edo who had experience with animals took up jobs in abattoirs and as butchers. But this just exposed them to continued hostility. There was even a protest by Yamabushi monks in 1872 trying to storm the imperial palace because the emperor ate meat. They linked it directly to the perceived impurity of butchery.
Wow. It's striking that even when they moved into new jobs, they were still sort of pushed into roles connected with their former status. And new terms started popping up too, didn't they?
Yes, the term kyueta, meaning former eta, came into use. And the former outcasts themselves sometimes chose to use shinhaimen, new citizens, as a way to kind of assert their equal status.
And I noticed in the sources, the word buraku itself, which just means hamlet or village, took on a negative meaning. How did that happen?
Right. So officials in the early 1900s began using the term tokushu buraku, or special hamlets, specifically referring to these former Edo villages. This official usage is basically what caused the simple geographic term buraku to pick up that negative, stigmatized connotation in certain regions. It became code.
So the legal change happened over a century ago, but this wasn't just some historical issue that vanished.
Yeah.
How did discrimination actually persist into the post-war period?
Well, one of the most, I think, striking insights is how a seemingly neutral administrative tool, the traditional family registration system, became a key mechanism for keeping discrimination alive.
The family registry, the kaseki, how did that work?
Yeah, the koseki was tied to ancestral addresses.
Yeah.
So by looking up someone's koseki, it was often possible to deduce if their family originated from a former Buraku area.
Yeah.
It literally linked individuals back to stigmatized locations, generation after generation.
That's, wow, a powerful way for history to just keep repeating itself. Where are these communities generally located today, or where were they identified?
Estimates from around the year 2000 suggested there were roughly 3 million people of Burakumin descent. They're primarily concentrated in Western Japan. A government report back in 1993 identified over 4,500 designated assimilation districts, or Dutuachiku, across the country.
Assimilation districts.
Yeah, though interestingly, none were found in places like Hokkaido or Tokyo or Okinawa, according to that report.
And the living conditions in many of these areas remain challenging, even into the modern era.
Yes, sources describe them as sometimes being slum-like, definitely with lower economic status and educational standards compared to the national average.
Did the government try to do anything about this?
They did, yeah. There was the Special Measures Law for Assimilation Projects. It was active from 1969 right up to 2002. It provided significant funding, we're talking, like an estimated 12 trillion yen.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, huge amounts for infrastructure improvements in these designated Dukuchiku. Things like housing, community centers, roads, that kind of thing. But, importantly, those projects were eventually terminated in 2002.
So despite the legal changes, despite even massive government funding for infrastructure, discrimination continued in really crucial areas of life. What were the main ways this showed up?
Marriage and employment were definitely key areas mentioned in the sources. Traditional families would sometimes illegally check backgrounds using the family registry to identify potential in-laws with Buraku ancestry.
Even though checking was illegal by then.
Yes, it still happened. Though, it's important to note, and this is a positive sign, rates of intermarriage have increased significantly. Nadamoto Masahisa's estimates suggest maybe 60 to 80% of Burakumin now marry non-Burakumin. That's a huge jump from maybe 10% in the past.
Okay, that is significant progress. Definitely a sign of changing times for many. What about finding work? Employment.
Employment discrimination also persisted for a long time. Companies were historically known to use these lists of Buraku addresses, some compiled illegally even after it was banned in 1975, to screen job applicants.
Secret lists.
Yeah. And the economic impact was clear. The average income of a Buraku family was significantly lower. One source said around 60% of the national average back in 1992.
And is this stigma more sort of prevalent in certain parts of Japan than others?
The sources suggest it is, yeah. Particularly in Western Japan, like the Kansai region around Osaka and Kyoto, stereotypes persist there, often associating Buraku residents with, squalor, unemployment, or criminality, especially among older generations.
And speaking of criminality, there's a sensitive point raised in the sources, isn't there, about a connection with the Yakuza?
Yes, it's a notable and obviously difficult association that gets mentioned. Estimates from researchers like David Kaplan and Alec Dubrow, and also former intelligence official Mitsuhiro Suganuma, suggest that people of Burakumin background account for a really significant percentage, potentially 60 to 70% of Yakuza members, especially in big syndicates like the Yamaguchi Gumi.
That's a very high percentage.
It is. It's a complex issue, of course, tied into poverty, discrimination, lack of opportunity. But it's an association that exists in the research.
And maybe that's part of why the sources note that public discussion of the whole Burakumin issue is somewhat limited in Japanese media.
Yes, I think the sensitive nature, the historical campaigns by activist groups, it's made it a topic that's often handled very carefully or sometimes avoided in open discussion.
Which brings us to the fight for liberation and rights itself. This has been a long struggle, hasn't it?
It really gained momentum back in the 1920s. That's when the Levelers Association of Japan, the Sueisha, was founded in 1922.
The Sueisha, they had a specific philosophy, didn't they?
Yeah.
Different from before.
They did. Their approach was quite confrontational compared to earlier assimilation ideas. They really encouraged pride, urging members to be proud of being Ada, which was a radical statement then.
Yeah.
And they reframed their ancestors not just as victims, but as manly martyrs of industry. Mankichi Saiko was a key figure in getting this started.
And after World War II, the movement continued, evolved.
Yes, it regrouped and eventually became the Buraku Liberation League, the BLL, in the 1950s. The BLL became very influential, particularly in the late 60s and 70s. They lobbied the government hard for concessions.
Like the Special Measures Law.
Exactly. That was a direct result of their pressure. They also publicized specific cases of discrimination, like the Sayama incident, which was a very controversial conviction of a Burakumin man.
And they achieved other concrete legal results, too.
Yes, significant ones. Crucially, that legislation banning third-party access to those sensitive family registries passed in 1976. That made it much harder to use the Koseki for discrimination, at least legally.
But the sources also point to, divisions within the movement itself. It wasn't all unified.
That's right. It wasn't a single monolithic bloc. The Zenkaran, the National Buraku Liberation Alliance, formed in 1979. They were affiliated with the Japanese Communist Party.
And they split from the BLL.
Yeah, they split off, disagreeing pretty strongly with the BLL's methods and also how government subsidies were being handled or allegedly misused. There was even a notable, quite violent clash between members of the two groups at Yoka High School back in 1974.
And the BLL itself was known for some controversial tactics, weren't they? These denunciation and explanation sessions.
Yes. The BLL used these sessions, Kidon sessions, for individuals or companies accused of discrimination, while the BLL saw them as necessary for accountability, making people confront their prejudice. And the sources mention early instances involved things like violence or even kidnapping. Their legality was often disputed, though authorities generally tended to avoid intervening except in really extreme cases. It was a very aggressive tactic.
There were even public clashes over criticism of the BLL, right?
Absolutely. In 1990, when Karel van Wolferen criticized the BLL in his influential book, The Enigma of Japanese Power, the BLL demanded the publisher actually halt the Japanese translation.
Wow. And the internal divisions even went international.
They did. In 1991, the Zenkaran, the rival group, actually informed the United Nations about alleged human rights violations committed by the BLL during these denunciation sessions.
So, reporting on each other to the UN.
Yeah. Despite this, the BLL's own international arm, IMBDR, became a UN-recognized human rights NGO just a couple years later, in 1993.
It's such a complex picture of activism, internal conflict, different strategies. Interestingly, one of the groups, the Zenkaran, eventually declared the issue basically resolved. What was that about?
Yes, that was in 2004. The Zenkaran announced they believed the Buraku issue, as a distinct problem requiring specific measures, was basically resolved. They disbanded and formed a new organization, the Zenkoku Jinkan-ren, with a broader focus on human rights in general.
But that declaration itself was controversial.
Oh, very much so. And it remains controversial among many activists and individuals, particularly those aligned with the BLL, who strongly believe the struggle against deep-seated discrimination continues.
Alongside all the activism, there have also been educational efforts happening.
Right. Efforts in education, often called Dua education, which translates roughly to assimilation education, though the term itself is debated.
Okay.
And awareness programs through things like human rights promotion centers have been ongoing since the 1980s. The aim is to promote understanding and combat discrimination against Burakumin and increasingly other minority groups in Japan too.
Before we wrap up, the sources touched briefly on the role of religion and also mentioned several notable figures from Burakumin backgrounds. What was the religious aspect?
Historically, some Burakumin communities had their own distinct folk religions and different burial practices compared to mainstream Buddhists. While many today follow the kind of mix of Shinto and Buddhism common in Japan, Shinbutsu Shugu, some communities still retain unique practices. Adopting Buddhism, particularly the Judo Shinshu sect, was sometimes seen as a path seeking acceptance, as that sect historically had ties to lower castes. Figures like Mankichi Saiko, the early activist, were even priests in that tradition.
And recognition of religious discrimination came later.
Yes, that aspect wasn't always highlighted, but BLL activism later pushed for recognition of religious discrimination as part of the broader issue.
And despite all the historical and ongoing challenges, many individuals from Burakumin backgrounds have achieved prominence in various fields, haven't they?
Yes, absolutely. The sources list figures like Jichiro Matsumoto, was often called the father of Buraku liberation for his post-war activism and political role.
And other politicians, too.
Yeah, politicians like Hiromu Nonaka, who was a very senior figure in the LDP government, and Tuchiro Hashimoto, the former mayor of Osaka and governor. Their backgrounds became public knowledge, sometimes controversially.
And also figures in arts and business.
Correct. The acclaimed writer Kenji Nakagami often explored Buraku themes in his work.
Yeah.
Actor Rentaro Mikuni, writer Manabu Miyazaki, and perhaps surprisingly to some, Tadashi Yanai, the founder of the global clothing giant Uniqlo. Their stories definitely highlight individual achievement against this backdrop of historical stigma.
So, looking back at this whole deep dive then, we've traced the path of the Burakumin from their origins as feudal outcasts, defined by, supposed impurity in specific jobs.
Through legal emancipation that, perhaps surprisingly, didn't instantly solve their problems. In fact, it even created some new ones, at least initially.
Right. To a group that continues in many ways to grapple with deep-seated social stigma and economic disparities in modern Japan, despite really significant legal and social progress driven by determined, sometimes divided activism.
It's a powerful and maybe uncomfortable reminder that being physically indistinguishable from the majority population did not prevent centuries of intense social stratification and discrimination from taking root and persisting. Appearance wasn't the issue.
Exactly. And that leaves us with a thought for you, the listener, to maybe carry forward. The Burakumin story really forces us to confront a fundamental paradox, doesn't it? How do these deeply embedded historical social structures and prejudices continue to shape modern societies even generations after the laws themselves change?
Yeah. And what does this specific history teach us about the critical and often painful difference between achieving legal equality on paper and attaining true social acceptance and integration in practice? It's a question that I think resonates far beyond Japan.